I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers and especially Loretta Gallagher for inviting me to be part of this wonderful Congress with you on the theme of the joy of Carmel, although it feels a little bit like I'm here by mistake because the secular Carmelites have always been very close to my heart, but it's been a very long time since I last was at a OCDS Congress. I think it's been 20 years or so because of all those years in Kenya, and I wasn't able to attend. So when I received the invitation, I was surprised, actually. But my first question to Loretta was, well, what sort of presentation do you want me to prepare? Are the speakers supposed to talk about joy in general as one of the hallmarks of Carmelite prayer and Carmelite life? Or are we supposed to focus on the theme of joy in one of our Carmelite saints, like joy in Teresa, joy in John of the Cross? Or I said, for example, of course, Teresa of the Andes, she talks about God as the joy of my life. So the next thing I knew, Loretta had listed me to give a talk on joy in the life of Teresa of the Andes. And that was especially alarming to me because of all our modern Carmelite saints, Teresa of the Andes is the one I think I know least about. But Loretta encouraged me, and she even supplied me with some reading materials. So I've been trying hard. You're a good audience, you know. Oh, okay. I've been trying hard to catch up. Actually, I'm still reading through her letters. And it's not lost on me that, you know, as a 74-year-old friar, I'm probably not the best qualified to speak about our teenage Carmelite saint, you know. And as someone whose own life view can be morose and pessimistic at times, I'm probably not the expert on joy, but here we are, and all I can do is ask the saint herself to help me communicate something of the joy that she wants to share with us this evening. Okay. And as I say, I mean, some of you may know a lot more about Teresa of the Andes than I do, so, you know, be prepared. You can be fact checkers, like at the presidential debates. You know, if you say, "Wait a second, no, it wasn't like that." So. But let me start with a word about joy itself. You know, it seems to be in the news a lot lately. Like, if you've been watching the evening news, they talk about bringing back the joy into politics these days. And I don't know whether that's joy or what it is, but I mean, then we hear that Kamala Harris has a strange laugh, and Donald Trump doesn't laugh at all. So, you know, where is the joy and all? But I've also learned that as I was trying to prepare this talk, that there's a growing body of scientific research on joy, especially among certain schools of psychology. And I wish I had time to have researched all of that, but I was working fast. So, and there's a great interest among theologians and spiritual writers, and perhaps encouraged in part by Pope Francis's emphasis on joy in his writings, which we'll hear about from Brother John Mary on the last day. Not the last day ever, but the last day of the Congress. So maybe on the last day also. I don't know. So let's see. In our own Catholic tradition, Thomas Aquinas and others talk about joy as a kind of a state of rest in which our wills are satisfied when we attain some desired object or goal. But they distinguish it from delight because they say animals can have delight. But what's different about joy is that you not only feel the delight, but you know you're feeling it. So that there's that element of understanding of the mind being involved. Joy for the scholastic theologians needs some kind of reflective awareness. Joy is often distinguished from other sorts of states like happiness, frivolity, mirth, ecstasy, and so on. Deep joy is something more profound and long-lasting. And traditionally, joy has been considered one of the passions or the emotions. That means it has to do with the impact of external factors on us. It's a way we react to something that affects us. We experience joy. Those of you who know John of the Cross well, you may remember that he talks about the four passions, as he calls them, of joy, sorrow, hope, and fear, and how they have to be properly directed and oriented. Joy can result from the satisfaction of our natural desires, and if any of you have seen the movie Inside Out or Inside Out 2, Joy is one of the important characters there. I haven't seen the second installment, but one of the things she learns is that joy has to include or incorporate some element of sadness too at times, and sorrow. So we can experience joy from satisfying our natural desires, and that's perfectly fine as long as the object and the means we use to reach it are morally good. For example, joy in a beautiful sunset, or joy in meeting old and new friends at an OCDS Congress, and so on. We know, too, that joy is included among the 12 fruits of the Holy Spirit, right? We had to memorize these when I was young, right? Charity, joy, peace, patience, benignity, good. Anyway, but joy was the second in the list, I remember. And that means as a fruit of the Holy Spirit, we experience joy when we live virtuously and under the Spirit's influence. And the New Catholic Encyclopedia says that the highest and most complete joy of which we're capable is the spiritual joy resulting from the blessed vision of God. Now that's supposed to be Dante there, so I don't know if that would give you ultimate joy, but the idea is the beatific vision is really the ultimate joy for human beings. Why? Because it's what we're made for. We're made to be transformed. We're made to live a life of union with God for all eternity. So to reach that goal and to realize that we've reached it is the greatest joy possible for human beings. And I think that helps us to understand the importance of joy for Teresa of the Andes' message, because God wants to be the joy of all our lives. We're all called, like her, to find our ultimate joy in God, and that joy begins even now in this life, the more we unite ourselves with Christ. So far, so good. Any mistakes, Loretta? Oh, okay. 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 So just to say a little bit about how is it that we have come to know about Teresa of the Andes. Because when I entered the order in 1972, Teresa of the Andes was virtually unknown in the English-speaking world, and she wasn't mentioned in most histories of Carmel written in English until fairly recently, after her beatification in 1987. She didn't leave behind any writings comparable to Teresa's story of a soul, nothing that long or extensive, or even Elizabeth's prayer to the Trinity. There's nothing in Elizabeth's writing, in Teresa of the Andes' writings that stands out quite as distinctively as those. We have her teenage diary, and we have some letters which weren't even fully published in Spanish until the 1970s and the 1980s. So the growing devotion to Teresa of the Andes, at least initially in Chile and in Latin America, was initially based not so much on her writings, but on what those who had known her said about her and on the blessings that people received when they sought her intercession. So there was, it was a kind of a popular coming up from the ground up, that interest in Teresa of the Andes. In the U.S., we owe a lot to Father Michael Griffin, who was a priest of the Washington province. He lived in our house in Washington, D.C., and he became interested in her in the 1980s, and he began translating what was available. Now, I always feel like I missed a great opportunity there, because Father Michael was a inveterate talker. So if you saw him coming down the hall, and he was in a talkative mood, you'd kind of run and hide, and because you could get trapped for an hour or two listening. But if I had listened, I probably would have learned so much about Teresa of the Andes, because there was a time there where that's all he wanted to talk about was Teresa of the Andes, when he was working on his books. And so in 1989, he published God, the Joy of My Life. And initially it had that cover on the left there, and later the cover on the right, because she was blessed and she was saint and so on. The one on the right is the current ICS Publications edition, which you can find in the shop across the hall there. And this includes a biography of her that he wrote, and which unfortunately I didn't read. I was just looking at it before I came down here, and I saw he had a whole section on joy in Teresa of the Andes. So you may see I didn't do sufficient homework, but I would say if you want to read more about on that theme of joy, buy the book. Yeah. And then in 1989, which was, sorry, I think I have that wrong there. The translation of the letters appeared in 1994, sorry, which was a year after she was canonized. So, and that includes all of her letters translated too. And again, the cover on the left, if you bought it years ago, that would be the older one. The new cover is on the right there, which again is across the hall there. And there are two other volumes that he put out too. One called Testimonies to Saint Teresa of the Andes, and another called A New Hymn to God. And these include mostly secondary documents, like the one on Testimonies. There's a very beautiful testimony about Teresa of the Andes that her brother Luis gave, and that's in there. And the first what they call circular letter that was written by the prioress of Los Andes after Teresa of the Andes died. Circular letter, I used to think that meant that the paper was, no, but it circulated among all the Carmels, so that they would have some account of the sister who had died. So those are interesting. And then in the other one, A New Hymn to God, he has a lot of the homilies and so on that were delivered in relation to her canonization and beatification. So also, you may know that this is Jennifer Moorcroft, who is, I think, a secular Carmelite, right? Yeah, but she works for the Center for Applied Carmelite Spirituality, right? So Father Alex knows her and so on. But she's been writing about Teresa of the Andes for quite some time. There's that book, God is All Joy, which ICS Publications has. There was another one she put out as a kind of a textbook to accompany their course on Teresa of the Andes called Juanita. And then most recently, and thanks to Loretta, I just became aware of this, that Godhead Here in Hiding, which is on the Eucharistic spirituality of Teresa of the Andes. That's only available in England, but I think you'll be able to get it through Amazon before too long, if it's not already there. And then finally, some of you have probably seen that there's a very, very long mini-series that was done for Chilean TV, just called Teresa of the Andes. We say when you watch, it's almost longer than her life, but it's very thorough, and it's well done. I mean, it's not kind of Hollywood production, but it's a good TV production of on her life and so on.
Just so you know, that's for tell them it's for
Yeah.
sale in the shop.
I saw at least one copy in the over there in the yeah, good. So so those are things. If you don't know much about Teresa of the Andes, you can consult all of those. And so I'm not going to go into enormous detail about her life, but I do want to talk about some key points in her biography. Um, that seem important, and there may be others that I miss, so our fact checkers can add. Her parents, now, I won't guarantee the quality of some of these pictures because if you go to the Teresa of the Andes website that the nuns at the Carmel of Los Andes have, the pictures are tiny and very low resolution and so on. So when you put them up on the screen like this, they may be very blurry. But her parents were Miguel Fernandez Jaraquemada and Lucia Solar Armstrong. The Armstrong crept in there. She had that, what was it? I forget, American somewhere, or anyway. Uh, so, uh, so she's born on July 13th, 1900, and 2 days later, which they point out was the eve of the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she was baptized. And she got this wonderful name of Juana Enriqueta Josefina de los Sagrados Corazones Fernandez y Solar. So pretty impressive, right? Yeah, but and that name tells you something about her devoutly Catholic family. It incorporates the names of her two grandmothers, and also the name reminds us that her mother had a great devotion to Saint Joseph, and both parents had a devotion to the Sacred Hearts, Los Sagrados Corazones. Yeah. But in the family, she was just known as Juanita, little Juana, right? That's what I'll call her mostly in the talk because she didn't really become Teresa of the Andes until, or Sister Teresa of Jesus until the last months of her life. So the family was a very large one by today's standards. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping around a little bit here. This was her mother's father, Don Eulogio, who was quite rich, and Juanita's family lived there in his house in Santiago, but not alone, as I'll say in a minute. They had it was a large extended family. There were besides Juanita's family. There was her Aunt Juana and her husband with their 6 children, and the Vicuña family, who were also relatives, and they had 2 children. But now I forgot to go through Juanita's siblings. Her older siblings included Lucia, born in 1894, Miguel, born in 1895. So she's born in 1900, so you can see that was like 5 years older. Luis, born in 1898, and her younger siblings included Rebecca, born in 1902, who later became a Carmelite nun herself, and Ignacio, born in 1910. So she's 10 years older than the last boy in the family. But she was closest to Luis, who was 2 years older, and Rebecca, who was 2 years younger. Now, in that picture, you can see, I think, in the upper left is her father with the eldest daughter, Lucia. You can see a big family jamboree there to the right of that picture. Down below on the left, you have Juanita with her sister Rebecca leaning her head on her shoulder there. They were very close. The middle picture is, I think that's her father with the youngest boy, Ignacio. And then on the far right, down below, is Luis, or Lucho as they called him, and Rebecca. So as Jennifer Moorcroft points out, when you think about it, I mean, the house she was living in was really a palatial mansion. And she was surrounded by all this extended family. And they had numerous servants besides, and they moved in aristocratic circles. So Later on, she writes about how she's attracted to the poverty of the Carmel of Los Andes, but she admits in her diary that, quote, Jesus did not desire me to be born poor like himself. I was born in the midst of riches, spoiled by all. So she was aware that her background was privileged. Her first years were more or less what you would expect of a girl from this time and place and social class. It seems like she was competitive and a kind of a tomboy. Her mother testified, said, "Don't think that Juanita was different from all the others. She loved to play and was first in the games her brothers arranged. Sometimes I had to intervene since Juanita was too active, straining too much, or playing at games that were more for boys." She said she usually won those games. So she had determination, I guess we'd say, like Teresa. She had her failings too, and she would get into squabbles. She could lose her temper, become over emotional sometimes. If she was asked to do something that she didn't want to do, she'd kind of drag herself around, as kids do. When she was 6, she started attending a school. Oh, let me see what I. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards there. Oh, we'll get to that in a second. When she was 6, she started attending a school run by the Carmelite Sisters of St. Teresa, but she was bullied there. And she went home and told her mother, and then the superior at the school got angry with Juanita because she's a tattletale, telling on things that happen in school. And Juanita's saying, "But I just told the truth, And anyway, her mother, after a month, pulls her out of there because that wasn't working. But a year later, she starts attending a different day school run by the Sisters of the Sacred Heart. And there she really thrives. She comes to excel. And with her siblings, she was also taught by her grandfather to ride horses at a young age. She became a rather accomplished equestrian. I mean, if you read some of her letters, she's always talking about having a wonderful day, riding a horse off to the mountains and so on. She was also a swimmer. She enjoyed tennis and croquet. In the Spanish edition of her writings, I saw they explained croquet is like golf. I said, well, not exactly. If you know what croquet is, I can't. But anyway, it's a more sedate. But when she was home from school, she attended parties where she often played the guitar, or she liked to sing. She played the keyboard too. So in other words, she comes across as a typical young girl and teenager. Typical, not so much in coming from a rich aristocratic family, probably few of us do, or riding horseback through the mountains on her vast family estates. I mean, maybe you do, I haven't done that, but the fact that she enjoyed the same kinds of activities that young people typically enjoy. What was unusual about her was the intensity of her religious devotion and fervor, something that people noticed when they would see her in church, lost in prayer. So from a very early age, she began praying, and she liked to hear people talk about God. And at 6, her mother and her aunt began taking her to daily mass, and she develops a great desire for the Eucharist. But she has to wait several years because they didn't give First Communion at 6. And at 7, it's interesting to compare the order of these things then and now. At 7, she makes her first confession, and she promises her brother Luis, they were both devout at that point, that they agree that they're going to say the rosary every day. So he was kind of instrumental in her Marian devotion. At 9, she's confirmed with Luis, and she begins to prepare for her First Communion. Well, you notice that now confirmation coming before First Communion. And she makes a serious commitment to work on her failings, especially her temper, and to grow more in detachment and humility. And also one of her aunts gives her a statue of Mary, and Juanita begins to develop a great devotion to the Blessed Mother. She believes that Mary can help her overcome her faults. But as it was with Teresa of Lisieux, as it was with Elizabeth of the Trinity, her First Communion on September 11th, 1910, she's 10 years old, is a decisive and unforgettable moment for Juanita. She writes in her diary, "It's impossible to describe." This was what it looked. Yeah, that's her at her first communion. It's impossible to describe what took place between my soul and Jesus. For the first time, she says, I experienced a delicious peace. And she adds, I experienced his dear voice for the first time. And you can see here, I mean, she's mentioning it almost in passing, but it's a reference to one of the more exceptional aspects of her spiritual life, namely that apparently she did have locutions. She heard the voice of Jesus within, and already she'd been hearing the voice of Mary too, sometimes speaking to her. In fact, as people generally note, that she thought this happened to everyone after their first communion, you know. And so she was a little embarrassed when she happened to mention it, I think, to her mother, to find out that, no, not everybody had this. And her mother said, maybe you better go talk to a priest. So she rarely talks about it except to her confessors and her spiritual guides. So you don't find references to this except in her spiritual diary and to some of her letters to her confessors. When she writes these friendly letters to friends, she never talks about this inner voice of Jesus. And these were extraordinary graces which nobody else in her family or her social circle seemed to have been granted, as far as we know. Probably few of us in this room have been granted this, but so in one sense, that might seem to separate her experience from that of most Christians and other young people. But yet, I mean, we all know in some way what it is to feel the Spirit within, or even our own conscience, nudging us to avoid evil and to do the good and so on. And for the most part, these are the kinds of concerns that Juanita's inner voice focuses on. That's to say, when she heard Jesus or Mary speaking to her interiorly, it was never to reveal some new doctrine or promote some novel devotion. Rather, these interior words were typically encouragements to grow in virtue, in love, in conformity to God's will, in detachment from creatures, and so on. And she never bragged about them. And in fact, I think she says in one of her, somewhere, that to one of her confessors, that every time she would get too inquisitive, you know, Jesus would sort of say, no, you don't need to know that. Focus on growing in virtue. She also had a few visions, but they were usually of the suffering Christ, asking that she join her sufferings to his. Now, I think it's important to remember what our Carmelite tradition tells us about these kinds of extraordinary phenomena, that it's not visions and voices that make for sanctity, but whether we grow in the love of God and neighbor, that those graces are meant to encourage. So in that respect, I think Juanita was a good disciple of John of the Cross, whether she knew it or not, because she never let herself get caught up in the externals of those extraordinary experiences, but she simply took from them whatever helped her to surrender her will more completely to God's will. It was more like an ongoing interior conversation with Jesus and Mary on how she could improve. And I think that, you know, echoes how our Holy Mother, St. Teresa, talks about mental prayer, that it's an intimate sharing between friends. So this was kind of like a prayerful conversation that she was always having. And in fact, after her first communion, people started to notice that she was changing. She was becoming a better person. She was gradually becoming more gentle, docile, and helpful to others. She reads Teresa's story of a soul for the first time at age 14. Yes, sorry. And the following year, 1915, 15 years old, she becomes a boarding student at a school run by the same Religious of the Sacred Heart. Initially, she hates being separated from her family, and she talks about the place as a dungeon. She says, I hope it burns to the ground, you know. But she applied herself to her studies, and she becomes one of the top students, and she comes to appreciate the religious environment of the school, that protected her in many ways from things that she might otherwise have, been gotten distracted by. Um, and she realizes, and she says that yes, she does understand that she's gifted, that she has a good mind, and that she's able to do these things well, and that she wants to do this to make her family happy, and so on. So she understands that we all have gifts, and that we're meant to use them. Although she sometimes calls herself a criminal nothingness, that's more in relation to our human state of being sinners before the all perfect God, I think. Um, uh, she had, now let me see what my next slide is. I don't even know here. Oh, yeah, okay, good. So this is her, the time she's going to this boarding school of the Sisters of the Sacred Heart. That's a picture of the school. And the other is during the summer times, she was often out in the countryside. They would go to one of the estates or something, and they'd spend the summer doing things there. So she's in the lower left of that group photo. Sorry, let me get a. How are we doing? Is the Sam Adams kicking in now? Is that for people falling asleep? So, she admires the sisters. She comes to admire the sisters in the school very much. And at times she thinks about maybe she should become a religious of the Sacred Heart herself. After all, I mean, de los Sagrados Corazones is Los Sagrados. It's part of her name even. But as she confides to the sisters at the school, she feels more strongly called to the Carmelites. And in fact, she makes a private vow of chastity later that year, not to admit any other spouse but Jesus Christ. And this desire for Carmel grows as she begins to read other Carmelite authors, like Teresa of Avila's Book of Her Life, and especially Elizabeth of the Trinity. And it's interesting to me how within just a few years, and none of these people were canonized at the time this was happening, that Elizabeth of the Trinity read Therese early on, read Story of a Soul, and was very much impacted by that long before Therese was canonized. And Teresa of the Andes read both Therese and Elizabeth and was influenced by both of them too. So you have this nice, kind of growing influence of these young women in Carmel. So you'll find when you read her writings that she'll make these references to merciful love, or that she wants to become a praise of glory like Elizabeth of the Trinity, or that she wants to build a little cell within where she can withdraw and be present to the God who's present within, and so on. You see the impact that they had on her. It wasn't superficial. In 1917, she receives the Child of Mary Medal from her school, which was a high honor in the school, and she takes it very seriously, and she starts to correspond with the Carmelite nuns. Interestingly, she doesn't feel attracted to the kind of, shall we say, wealthier or finer Carmel in Santiago, where she was from. If she had joined there, she would have been close to home, but she felt much more attracted to the poorer and more remote community of Los Andes. And so she had come to recognize, as she puts it, that the vocation of the Carmelite is to suffer and to pray, and that's something she'd already been trying to do. At the age of 1918, she graduates from school, and she's writing periodically to the prioress of Los Andes asking for admission. And in September, she gets an affirmative answer. And meanwhile, she briefly struggles with last-minute doubts about, should I be a religious of the Sacred Heart? Should I be a Carmelite? But and she has been doing ministry herself. She realizes that, she doesn't denigrate the work that the religious of the Sacred Heart do. She sees the value of it and the great apostolate and how much they have to sacrifice themselves for their pupils and so on. During the summers, she's leading missions and catechetical programs for the local children and things like that. So she's very keen on that. But she comes to recognize that through her contemplative prayer and constant surrender to God as a Carmelite, she'd be of even greater value to others, since that was what God was asking of her. In one place she says, I don't know where she got her facts, but Saint Teresa, she says, saved more souls than Francis Xavier. So, but she's basically trying to say that, I mean, that the role of of the contemplative Carmelite life is apostolic, that's the purpose of it, that the nuns aren't there for their own salvation, but they're there for the good of the church and for all of us. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, so far so good. So her big concern was just whether she had the health for the life of Carmel, whether her parents would give their permission, and whether there'd be a sufficient dowry. Leaving her family was very painful, especially since some of them didn't support this decision. But on May 7th, 1919, she enters the Carmel of Los Andes, and she's given the name Teresa of Jesus. And these two photos actually, I mean, I had always thought that photo of her was actually after she was a Carmelite nun. No, they didn't allow cameras in the Carmel of Los Andes. They had to take this before she ever entered. So they borrowed a habit and put it on, and took the photo so they'd have a memento of what she would look like as a Carmelite nun. So that's before she's actually a Carmelite. She starts her novitiate. She's very happy in Carmel. And by this time, from what you can judge from the diary, she seems to have reached the summit of her mystical life. At least she writes in there about times of prayer when she couldn't meditate, she just remained lovingly in the presence of God, or of other times when she felt completely absorbed, or of times of great darkness and aridity, a kind of a dark night of the spirit, of union, and so on. But she also had always had this premonition that she was going to die young. It's something that this inner voice had told her long ago. And in March 1920, she assures the Carmelite confessor of the nuns that she'd die within a month. So now that's the only picture taken. I think when she was in Carmel. There, she's a novice, I think. So because she just has the white, doesn't have the whole habit there. I'm not sure exactly the date when that was taken. Maybe our fact checkers know. So sure enough, 2 weeks after she told this Carmelite confessor that she would die within a month, on April 2nd, Good Friday, the novice mistress discovers that she's running a high fever, and she puts her to bed. And her health gets progressively worse. She's given confession, communion, and extreme unction, anointing of the sick. And on April 7th, they give her this diagnosis of advanced typhus. Now, nowadays, interestingly, some are saying that maybe it was actually the Spanish flu, because they were having that was going around pretty badly at that time. But she's allowed to make her religious profession early because of the danger of imminent death. So she dies on April 12th as a professed Discalced Carmelite nun at the age of 19 years and 9 months. So she's our teenage Carmelite saint, right? The funeral and the burial take place 2 days later. And of course, that might have been the end of the story, but somehow word starts spreading that a holy nun has died in the Carmel. And people begin coming in large numbers. I wonder, I mean, what was it that made that happen? Of course, remember, 1920, we're right in the midst of the big fervor around Teresa of Lisieux. So people were already kind of primed for holy Carmelite nuns who die young. I mean, she shares the same name as Therese, right? I mean, Teresa in French is Therese. But her brother Louis says, he was the one who was most distressed when she left for Carmel and just felt abandoned. But he came to the funeral and he was just amazed at the number of people who showed up. I mean, this was, these were people he didn't know. They weren't friends of the family or anything. There was a whole lot of priests there at the funeral, and so word was getting around. This was, her popularity continued to grow. And the diocesan process for her beatification started in 1947. She was eventually beatified in 87 and canonized in 93. And the Chilean bishops declared her patron of children, especially the homeless and those in juvenile detention. And she's been one of the patrons of World Youth Day several times because of her appeal to the young. And this is the current shrine for Teresa of the Andes there. She's buried in the center there. The nuns no longer live in the same convent where she lived. So perhaps you might want to say at this point, well and good, but what does all this have to do with joy? And I'll admit that when I read her personal diary, for example, it sort of first struck me as, yeah, this is a teenage diary. It's kind of focused on her personal preoccupations in a way that you might expect of any teenager. I mean, you never guess from reading it that anything else was going on in the world outside, like World War I, for example, which she never mentions. Of course, they're down in Chile, they're not in Europe. She wasn't interested in politics or other things like that. I think what's remarkable about it is that instead of focusing on the kinds of things that you might find in most teenage girls' diaries, whether some boy likes her or not, or what should she wear to the prom, or whether she's popular, or how many likes she has, or whatever. And the boys can be that way too, I think. But what she confides to her diary is her remorse for her own failings and imperfections, her ever-increasing love for Jesus, her ever deeper attraction to prayer, her ever more intense desire to surrender herself completely to God's transforming grace, and so on. And it's interesting, too. I was looking as I was going through the diary part, saying, okay, now let's see how many times does she mention joy? It's not there a whole lot, actually, in the diary. And when it is, it's most often in the context of talking about her joy in suffering. And so you might wonder, in the first place, how much suffering was there in her life? I mean, she's living a pretty privileged life. She's surrounded by a loving family. She's got all the creature comforts. So she didn't suffer from any lack of material resources. She didn't experience abuse or the terrible trauma of children growing up in Gaza today or places like that. But when we look deeper, I mean, there were real sufferings in her life. We've already mentioned her concern that health issues might keep her from Carmel. She had a number of serious medical crises and life-threatening illnesses in her youth. And given the state of medicine at the time, the cures were often more painful than the illness. But she made a strong resolution that she was going to try not to complain about this and to put the burden on others, but to just accept it for, in union with Christ. And her family, as good as it was, had tensions that I think sound very familiar to us today, and which caused her a lot of anguish. Her father, for example, was a good person, but not a good businessman. And his poor management of the family estates meant that he lost a lot of the wealth that the family had inherited from his wife's father. And so, as Juanita's getting older, the father's staying away more and more. And they say, well, I mean, it never comes out explicitly, but it was probably out of embarrassment and probably out of not wanting to confront the wife's disapproval. So he was often absent when Juanita needed him the most. And in some of the letters are very poignant, where she's saying, oh, Daddy, can't you come home now? We're all missing you, and so on. We really need you here for this or that. And he wouldn't show up. Miguel, the oldest son, he was already drinking heavily, and he was sliding into a kind of bohemian lifestyle. Luis, or Lucho, her favorite brother, who was 2 years older, was kind of drifting away from the faith. It was ironic because he was the one, as I said before, that had kind of gotten Juanita interested in devotion to Mary. And Juanita more than once offers her life for the conversion of these family members. Her sister Rebecca, who was 2 years younger, had a kind of emotional breakdown when Juanita entered the convent. So in her diary, she's often talking about how she finds joy in suffering, and that that the vocation of the Carmelite is prayer, mortification and suffering, but it's not because she's a masochist. It's rather that she sees suffering as a way to unite herself with the one she loves madly. You know, she talks about that she's madly in love with this Jesus who's madly in love with her. And so Jesus embraced suffering for our salvation, and so we unite ourselves with him when we accept suffering for his sake. And she writes, for example, that heaven is on the cross, she says, because Jesus is there on the cross. And so she freely embraces suffering as a way of helping others. And I think that's always difficult. It's tricky to explain theologically because we never want to suggest that we've got a bloodthirsty God who's up there, asking, who's demanding suffering to appease his wrath or something. You can get into a very kind of twisted idea of God if you go down that road. And yet somehow all our Carmelite saints understand that there's joy in suffering for those who love God because it unites us to his son, Jesus, in the work of the world's redemption. Somehow we can participate in that through our joining our sufferings to his. I think the theme of joy comes out much more clearly in her letters and in the testimonies of those who knew her. In her own family, with all of its tensions, she was a calming and joyful presence. As I mentioned, she was always writing to her father to encourage him, tell him he was loved and missed, and asking him to come home. They say that actually, that the oldest sister, Lucia, was the father's favorite, and that clearly showed in the family. But Juanita never complains about that. And later on, it was kind of only at the end that the father really appreciated what a treasure he had in Juanita, his daughter. Her mother could be critical and overbearing, but Juanita remained always close to her. The family tended to ostracize that oldest brother, Miguel, because of his bohemian lifestyle, but she was always charitable to him. And he would say, he'd say, I don't fit in very well at home these days, but as for her, she's a real saint. He'd say. She was particularly close, as I mentioned, to Luis. And Luis got into trouble when he started studying, having to read secular philosophy and all the arguments for and against the existence of God and so on. And little by little, his faith was eroding. And interestingly, in the school where Juanita was, they were reading some of these same texts and so on. But for Juanita, they never shook her faith. And she never condemned Luis for his doubts, or she never tried to debate with him about that. She would, for example, he reports, that she would just hug him and lean on his shoulder and say, "Don't you experience God when you're with me?" And so she wanted to be the one who could communicate the reality of God to him through her own life. And her last words to him when he was there and she was entering into the Carmel, she whispered in his ear, she said, "God exists, my brother, and never forget that." So she also had a great concern for her sister Rebecca, who she knew was going to take it very hard when Juanita entered Carmel. And I think in all these cases, she helped her family more by what she was and what she did than by what she said. Luis later testified, he said, Juanita was very attractive physically. Her way of expression was very pleasant and agreeable. She was quite tall and had a certain majesty of movement. She was joyful and seemed always happy. Her joy was neither loud nor boisterous. And again, he writes, she was very service-minded to the point of being self-sacrificing. She served us all. Juanita's charity was without limit toward the poor who visited our home. Juanita, with her grace and joyfulness, was the angel of our home. And she spread this same kind of joy among all her friends and acquaintances. She was known as a joyful and attractive person. And so many of her friends, her young women friends that she went to school with and so on, and who were in her social circle, so many of them also chose religious life because of her influence at a time when other young people were pursuing much more worldly careers. In other words, her enthusiasm for God was contagious. Now, there's much more I could say here. We've already mentioned that she was able to find joy in suffering insofar as she could unite it to Christ's suffering for the sake of others. She found joy in solitude and prayer. That was what attracted her so much to Carmel. She found joy in serving others, as we hear Luis testifying. As I say, she spent much of her vacation time organizing missions, catechism classes, lending a hand to the poor here and there as needed. She found joy in Mary as her example and intercessor, and as someone who always led her closer to her son. She found joy in the Eucharist. She writes often about that. I mean, there's a little bit of this prisoner of the tabernacle in there, which was a popular kind of approach at that time. But it's clear that, she's got this tremendous faith in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist and this great desire to be united with him in the sacrament. She was always eager to receive communion. She was always concerned when it wouldn't be available, because there's where she most closely encountered the one she called her mad lover and whom she loved so madly. She could spend hours in prayer in front of the tabernacle. She found joy in Carmel because it was there she felt most at home, where she could focus entirely on the Lord. And I think all of that just says that most of all, she found her joy in Jesus Christ, who was the love of her life. He was the source of all her joy, and she wanted to share that joy with others. And that's perhaps why Teresa of the Andes appeals so much to the youth today, because she is a young person. She combines holiness and joy in such a normal, human, and attractive way. And I think it also makes her very timely in light of what Pope Francis is always reminding us about joy, that we're never going to be able to draw others to faith by our words and example if they don't convey a certain joy. If we're joyless, who's going to be attracted to that if we're not joyful people? And I think also it's a good reminder that Teresa, our Holy Mother, wants her daughters and sons to be ministers of joy. You remember how she said, "God, deliver me from sad-faced saints." And at the end of the way of perfection, she insists that the holier Carmelites are, the more affable and approachable they'll be. And, or as Francis de Sales says, you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar, right? So in that respect, I think Teresa of the Andes is a true daughter of her famous namesake, even if she only bore the name Teresa for 11 months. So let me just close with one real quick quote, if I can find. I don't think I have any more slides. Let me see. No, that's it. Okay. Yeah. She wrote to a friend, "I am happy in Carmel. I am happy, in fact, the happiest creature in the world. I'm beginning a heavenly life of adoration, of praise, and of continuing love. God is infinite joy." So, Teresa of the Andes, pray for us. And thank you. Yeah.